I guess if you ride a bicycle much, you're familiar with dealing with fixing flats because it's about the most common serious disabling problem that comes up with a bicycle. You get them on cars too, but since cars have so much more power, they can carry around these heavily armored tires which deal with the problem a lot better. Another thing about bicycle tires is they tend to run at much higher pressure than car tires, so it's much easier for some little thing to cause some damage to the tire just because it's got to hold so much pressure. Now, of course, really the most common maintenance thing on bicycles is oiling the chain, but many people forget about that entirely. But really, to keep the bicycle running well, I will just throw that in. The chain does need to be oiled every now and then, but I'll just drop that on you and leave that for the moment. But of course, when the tire goes flat, that's really the bicycle just won't go. So we're going to talk about some of the things that cause flats and some of the possible remedies that you have for them. Now, of course, a few things, just in general, if you get a flat, one thing that you want to do is get to a safe location to work on it. Safe and comfortable. I mean, I've known of people who sat down in a pile of fire ants to fix their bicycle tire. You don't want to do that. In general, I think your biggest concern is going to be the sun. If it's really hot out, well, okay, it's easy enough to ride around and have fun in the sun, but when you actually have to start doing something frustrating, that's when you can really start getting the heat build up and that sort of thing. So if you cannot find much shade, at least try to get your head into the sun, because that's the thing that can really get screwed up if you start getting overheated. So at least get under a telephone pole or something where you can't directly see the sun. Now, there are basically 4 things that I can think of that cause punctures. If anybody else can think of another one, throw in. Well, not punctures, but flats. First one being punctures. Something actually pokes its way through the tire and into the tube. Now, there's a few things that can be done about this right at the start. One is you get yourself a tire that has some kind of belt built into the tire. And there's a few different kinds. One that people are most familiar with is Kevlar. This is a cross-section of a tire with a Kevlar belt, and I've got some very sharp, pointy objects for you to stab away at that to your heart's content, just to see how difficult it is to get through the Kevlar. Now, of course, Kevlar adds a little bit of weight to the tire, so folks who are looking to go really fast may stay away from Kevlar, may want to look for something lighter, but I'm figuring that people who are riding for transportation, for practical purposes, well, they don't want to be carrying bricks around, but they don't want to be slowed down by flats. Because, of course, anytime you do have to work on a bike, it's going to be a big, grungy mess. Now, a recent development of Kevlar is what they call Vectran, which is basically similar. It's just a slightly different formulation of the same stuff, but it's a denser weave, basically. It's a slightly different weave. It's a little bit stronger. There are a few different types of Vectran. You can find various manufacturers selling Vectran tires, but what you're really looking for is the densest possible weave. Vectran is a little bit lighter, but of course, as is typical with anything you buy on your bicycle, the lighter it is, the more expensive it is. For weight weenies who want something really light, you can get a nylon belt built into the tire. It's better than nothing, but it's not as good as Kevlar. Now, a problem with any of these setups is if something gets embedded in the tire, it can eventually work its way through the Kevlar belt. The belt is basically fixed in place, and so if you get a shard in the tire, then every time the tire goes around, it may get driven a little bit further through. So even a Kevlar belt can be compromised, but you might keep your ears open. If you're hearing some rhythmic noise coming from the tire every time it goes around, it may be that there's something stuck in the tire. One way of getting around that is they have liners. People are probably most familiar with liners like the Mr. Tuffy, the venerable old plastic Mr. Tuffy, basically a plastic strip that gets put in between your tire and your tube. This is a more recent redesign of that. This is called a spin skin, and it's basically a Kevlar belt sewn into a cotton belt, which is like the Tuffy put in between the tire and the tube.
A whole lot lighter.
Yes, much lighter, much stronger, and of course, much more expensive. You're looking at about $25 or $30 for a belt like that. Granted, it will probably outlast your tire.
Repair though.
For one.
Oh.
Now, a nice thing about a belt like a spin skin is that since it's not fixed in place in the tire, it has the ability to retreat. Something jabs through the tire, it hits the liner can retreat. So it's not held in place against the shard or whatever it is it's trying to poke through. Now, some downsides of liners, a problem I've always had with Toughies is that if you're using a high pressure tire and you've got a tube pumped up to a really high pressure, that can press against the liner and you can eventually get damage to the tube coming from the liner. That's an advantage to the thinner setup there. I can't claim that I have always had 100% luck with even those liners, but plenty of people had. Your big concern tends to come right at the edge of the liner. And so I get this flap and I open it up and I look at where the hole in the tube is, and there I can even see where the edge of the liner was pressing into the tube. So that's a caveat with those. They've got the advantage that they can retreat before an advancing puncture, but they are something that's actually pressing into the tube. Whereas with something built into the tire, you don't have to worry about it. You don't have to make sure that it's lined up properly. Another problem you can get with liners is you put it in there, and then in the process of wrestling the tire onto the rim, you've moved the liner out of place, or you've bunched up the liner or something like that. You can actually take this out and it will outlive the tire. Sometimes if you've ever changed a tube, you find that the tube is like stuck fast to the tire and you've got to peel it away. That's why they put talcum powder inside tires, dust it with that as a lubricant so it doesn't stick together. Now, this is a recent innovation they have in tires. It's a much heavier sort of armoring of a tire. That's an India rubber belt. That is basically, it's the brute force approach. It's simply so thick that something can jab into it and it can embed itself in the tire. It just doesn't make its way through that. The belt is so thick. However, the downside of that setup is it's a lot heavier. If you hold it in your hand, even though that's a much thinner cross-section of tire, compared to one of the Kevlar belts and the like, it's just a much heavier setup.